Welcome back to Power and Politics. NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh is getting a lot of questions about his stance on pipelines. Here's what he said yesterday.
I believe that the federal government has significant powers, significant constitutional powers, but I don't think it's effective to impose pipelines on communities. It's not the way to go ahead. And so what I said very clearly is I would not impose pipelines. What I believe in is working with provinces, working with Indigenous communities, and making sure we move forward in collaboration. We can't continue down the same path. It just doesn't work. Quebec is different. And so we're giving a different consideration for Quebec, absolutely. And I'm proud of that. That's a part of our federalism, which recognizes the unique nature of Quebec.
Those questions for Mr. Singh came after our power lunch with him, in which he told us he would not impose resource projects or national infrastructure projects on provinces that don't want them. Singh now says that's not the same thing as giving provinces a veto, well, except for Quebec. So what's the difference between not imposing something and a veto, and how exactly would this kind of federalism work? Let's ask those who have negotiated with the federal government. Time for the Premier's League. Christy Clark was BC's Premier from 2011 to 2017. She's now Senior Advisor with Bennett Jones and joins us from Vancouver. In Toronto, Darrell Dexter was Premier of Nova Scotia from 2009 to 2013, now Vice Chair with Global Public Affairs. And here with me, Premier of PEI from 2007 to 2015, now President and CEO of the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association, Robert Giz. Hello to all three of you. Pleasure to have you here.
Hi there.
Nice to be here.
Mr. Giz, I'll start with you. What is your reaction to the idea? I mean, you led a province, so are you happy to hear that an NDP-led government would never impose anything on a province?
I always, when I was Premier, had more of a nationalist view. And I think that you need to look at where the jurisdiction stands on a specific issue. When it comes to pipelines, it falls under federal jurisdiction. Yes, it's important, as Mr. Singh said, to go out and collaborate and try to get different communities on side. The problem is governing is not always easy. To get a 100% approval is never going to happen. So I think that you do need to have those federal powers to be able to do that. And I think if there is a project that is in the national interest, the federal government, whether it's popular or not, has to go ahead and make those decisions and cannot give a veto to a province over an issue that is of national importance.
Do you agree, Ms. Clark?
I couldn't agree more. And here's the thing. What Jagmeet Singh is saying is he wants to give up every single bit of leverage that the federal government could possibly deploy to try and make sure that these projects which are in the national interest go ahead. So what he's saying is, and you know, it's ridiculous to say that Quebec gets a veto, but British Columbia doesn't, but he's not going to force it on British Columbia either. I mean, I just, you know, you could take 100 political science students their first year, and they'd come up with a better answer than that. But you know, the thing is that if the federal government gives up its right to be able to impose things that are in its jurisdiction, then we don't have a country anymore. And I'm not a big fan of the federal government intervening. I think that Justin Trudeau has been the most interventionist prime minister we've had since his father. I think it's been very bad for the Federation. But I do respect the fact that they have powers under the Constitution that are given to them. And I don't support the federal government vacating the field and saying no more ports will be built, no more pipelines will be built, no more airport expansions will be built. Think about the range of major infrastructure the federal government has direct control over that will not happen in Canada, because guess what? 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people complain, and suddenly the national interest is shunted aside.
Yeah, I take that point, but to play devil's advocate, Mr. Dexter, Mr. Singh seemed to be saying, well, the current system isn't working if you look at TMX, for example, or that the genesis of his argument, and of course there has been lots of criticism like Ms. Clark's that it won't work, but the genesis of it is that he wants to try and build consensus on major projects. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I don't think he ever used the word veto either. And what he talked about was respect for the provinces and the premiers and the positions that they take. And I'm a little surprised to hear what Christy has to say, because after all, she once said that it would be a national political crisis if they were to impose a pipeline on British Columbia without social license. It seemed to me
that's not true, Darrell.
Well,
I'll get you back in. I'll get you back in, Ms. Clark.
was there too.
That is, I went back and reread your comments today just to make sure that I got them right. You know, I remember when we were all together.
Get them right, Daryl.
When we were all together, we talked very much about the question of whether or not we would respect the decisions of other premiers. And in fact, when the first National Energy Strategy came forward, BC didn't sign on to that because they disagreed with what the national strategy purported and stayed out of the National Energy Plan for a couple of years.
Ms. Clark,
Yes.
you wanted to get back in?
Yeah, that's for sure. So first of all, my government signed off on a harmonized review process for all the pipelines that were going through British Columbia. We set up in place the 5 conditions so that we could ensure that there was social license, so we could ensure the projects got done, not so that they couldn't get done. And at the end of the day, before the government changed in British Columbia, we explicitly signed off again, because we were required to do so by the courts, to Trans Mountain, which is the one pipeline the federal government, this current federal government, hasn't killed so far. It's not true to say that British Columbia ever said we don't want a pipeline imposed on us. What we said was the federal government does have the right with Trans Mountain, because it's an interprovincial project, to get it done. And what I would argue is that the current federal government hasn't gotten it done. I mean, it's true Jagmeet Singh's got this crazy anti-infrastructure, anti-national interest argument, but it's also true that the current federal government hasn't gotten these projects done either, because they won't move forward with it. They don't have the political will, they don't have the temerity to say, look, Canadians, we need to get this done if we want to preserve things like our healthcare system, and they're just not getting it done.
Switzerland jumped in.
Of course, Mr. Giz, I want to get you into. I just wonder, like, the idea, I mean, many premiers have talked about the idea of social license in their province, right? We hear the Premier of Quebec right now. It is a very real issue that whoever becomes Prime Minister will have to deal with.
Absolutely. And I think Daryl and Christy both had some good points there.
You can referee,
but I was in the room, and Christy is right. She didn't say I'm going to veto it, I'm going to stop it. She said, I've got 5 conditions. Now, if those 5 conditions weren't met, I don't know what would have happened, but
they were met.
They were met. But if they weren't,
yeah.
I don't know what would have happened. But Christy is a nation builder, so I'm sure she probably would have still approved it. But it's difficult to say. I look at myself as Premier PEI. We had no pipelines going through Prince Edward Island. But I was for Keystone, I was for Energy East, I was for TMX. Why was I? I didn't get any bonus points in Prince Edward Island being for those, but I was for them because I believe it's important as a country that we use our natural resources to be able to deliver our social programs all across our country.
What if the people who live in your province were opposed to it? What if you were hearing from those constituencies? And I'm not assuming that the majority of any province is, but what if that were the case?
And that's where I cut some politicians some slack, or some premiers some slack, because if it is in your own province and you're feeling that heat, that's why it's not the final decision of the premier of that province when it's a national project like this. That's why it's the federal government's decision. And sometimes a leader, a prime minister, needs to go out there and make the tough decisions, such as Prime Minister Trudeau did with regards to the TMX. We didn't see Energy East over the last 10 or 15 years. We didn't see a lot of things done. And I think you need a strong federal government to be able to take these national projects and be able to push them through even when there isn't a social license, because you're not always going to get the social license.
Yeah, and I'm not...
Hold on, let me get Mr. Dexter in next. Sorry, let me get Mr. Dexter in next.
And I'm not rejecting the argument that either of them, either Christy or Robert, are making. The jurisdictional purview of the federal government is on interprovincial workings. They have the constitutional ability to move forward with the project, but they also have the right to decide when they will go ahead with a particular project, and if they decide not to. So that jurisdictional right works, in both directions. And what I heard from Jagmeet Singh was that he was going to respect the decisions that were made by the premiers of provinces. He was going to seek to find the same kind of ground that Christie has described as a social license to ensure that these projects go forward in a reasonable manner, that they meet some of the most basic tests with respect to the citizenry in provinces.
To be fair, though, he did say that Quebec would have a veto, and that if those provinces weren't on board, he would never impose it. Ms. Clark, final word to you on this subject, and then I also want to get to Bill 21 too, though.
So here's what I heard Jagmeet Singh say. There will be no pipelines approved in Canada. If you can't get one through Quebec because they have a veto, and you can't get one through British Columbia because the NDP government in British Columbia doesn't want one, we will never get Canadian oil to Tidewater, and we'll continue to lose hundreds of dollars a day on every barrel of oil that leaves the country and goes to the United States to create jobs in Donald Trump's America.
That isn't contrary to the federal NDP's thought, right?
Well, I know, but let's just be clear.
He's
not saying he wants to build pipelines.
That's not what I heard.
He's not saying he wants to build infrastructure. He's saying he's taking a position that will never allow these things to get built. That's the reality of what he's saying. Yeah. He can't put it that way. He's a politician, but that's the reality that Canadians will be facing should Jagmeet Singh become the Prime Minister.
I'll let Mr. Dexter weigh in quickly, and then I do really want to talk about Quebec as well. So, Mr. Dexter.
Sure. I mean, that kind of flies in the face of what Robert said. I believe that the provinces, in fact, are all nation-building provinces. We all appreciate the fact that we're a part of this great federation. What the leader of my party is saying is that there's a reasonable way to go about that. It's to go about accommodating the premiers, who, after all, have their own jurisdictional purview, and that he wants to work with them and respect them. And I think that's an important important
you still need to make the tough decisions at the end of the day.
Let's talk about Quebec and so-called Bill 21, which is that province's secularism law. It's a controversial law supported by a majority of Quebecers, but it is definitely posing some difficulties for various leaders on the campaign trail. I want to play some clips, and then I'll get the former premiers to weigh in.
We clearly have condemned Bill 21. The Green Party finds it to be an unacceptable intrusion into the individual rights of Canadians. So I've worked to remove the discrimination and hopefully be able to do it in conjunction with a government in Quebec.
This is not a stage in which we should intervene, but I will highlight that we're not going to close the door on intervening at a later date, because I think it would be irresponsible for a federal government to close the door to intervention ever.
Well, I understand the jurisdiction, and I understand that there is a legitimate jurisdictional question here. That's a legal question about jurisdiction and what provinces can or can't do.
This was a decision taken by elected officials in Quebec. We have no intention of intervening in the court case. The court case is proceeding. The Quebecers will pursue that through the courts, and the courts will ultimately decide.
So, Mr. Giz, some slight variances in their positioning, but nobody is willing to legally intervene to fight this law. Do you think that that is the right decision?
Yes. This is a very difficult topic, and I'm going to break it down into two or three different things here. One, I think we need to realize that it is before the courts right now. The courts are going to set what the boundaries are, and then later on a politician can step in, or a federal government can step in and decide what mechanisms they may be able to lever to be able to combat that, or to figure out how to deal with it from a federal jurisdiction point of view. The second thing is, Premier Legault right now is an extremely popular premier in the province of Quebec. It would be disastrous politically, I think, as a federal party leader to go in right now and try to take on Premier Legault. Now, having said that, you see what politicians do. Doug Ford was popular a year ago. He's not as popular now, so that's why you see Prime Minister Trudeau mentioning Doug Ford all the time. So I think they are taking the right approach. Let the courts play it out, but also it would be not a very smart move politically to be taking on Premier Legault right now.
Mr. Dexter, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I have to agree with Robert's analysis there. I think Jagmeet Singh's participation in this election is a challenge to the kind of underlying parts of that legislation. But at the same time, I don't think any politician would be very well advised to kind of get ahead of the process that's already in place. There are cases going forward in the courts, and you want to know kind of what the ground is that you're dealing with, what the courts are going to decide before you start to make decisions about what further you would do.
Do you think that's the reason, Ms. Clark, everybody's decided to stay out of this, or is it more the political calculation that Mr. Giz alluded to?
Well, I think I mean, we all know it's just all politics. That's why they're not saying anything. But I don't take a political view of this. This Bill 21, which would force a Sikh to take off his turban, or an Orthodox Jew to take off their kippah, or to force, I mean, a deeply religious person, a Catholic, to take off their cross. It is absolutely contrary to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that was introduced by Pierre Trudeau, this Prime Minister's father. And there is no doubt in my mind that if Pierre Elliott Trudeau was Prime Minister today, he would absolutely be making sure this was a central issue, because it is people's rights in Canada that are being disregarded. And I can't believe that the media hasn't been a lot more aggressive. I mean, Justin Trudeau sits there and says, well, you know, I'll let you know my position on it after the election. That's not good enough. Jagmeet Singh takes a similar position, except that he says if he says anything about it, he's politicizing a court process, which is absolutely not true. He's getting away with it. The Conservatives, I think this is at least consistent with where they were appearing to be in the last election. I just can't believe that the media has really allowed these three politicians who are vying for Prime Minister to walk away from this vitally important issue for people's rights in this country without taking a clear position on exactly how they would deal with this violation of the Charter.
I would argue
and
they're not getting
politics
it.
aside,
They get questions
it's
about
wrong.
it every day. They get questions. I mean, they get questions about it every day, because the fact is that they keep saying, Mr. Giz, that they are vehemently opposed to what this law stands for, but not a single one of them is willing to do anything concrete about it at this time.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on Christie's first point there, and that is, I agree wholeheartedly with her. You know, from my personal perspective, I don't believe in that bill either. Having said that, the provincial governments all have their own powers, and this provincial government has used the notwithstanding clause to be able to bring this forward. And there are a lot of legalities that are happen with regards to using the notwithstanding clause. We're going to wait to see what the courts say, and then deal with it after. I've heard Prime Minister Trudeau say, you know, that he doesn't like it either. Most probably don't like it. I don't know any federal leader that would, but you also need to deal with it in a manner in which you make sure you have all your facts before you jump in.
Do you really think?
You know, for heaven's sakes, they should take a stand. These guys should be clear, and women should be clear with Canadians of, you know, for heaven's sakes. People are really tired of just all the gobbledygook in politics. And I think this election, we are seeing more gobbledygook than we've ever seen, if that's a political, technical term. And on this particular issue, where we are talking about people's fundamental right to their freedom of expression, their freedom of religion, their ability to be able to work in the public sector, could Jagmeet Singh, if he's elected Prime Minister, even go to the Assembly to make a presentation if if he refuses to take off his turban? These are really important issues, and I think on issues of people's fundamental rights, Canadians deserve answers.
Mr. Dexter, a quick final word to you.
Yeah, well, sure, and he's been very clear that he doesn't support that legislation. Christie's quite right. He couldn't be a teacher, for example, in Quebec. But there is some very important questions about what exactly it is that the federal government could do, you know, considering the use of the notwithstanding clause, and you know what they would be able to, you know, how they would be able to force a province to give up its jurisdiction in this matter. So it is important to hear what the courts have to say. They often point the way to remedies to these kinds of problems, and this is a very difficult one, no question.
Okay, I have to leave it there. Thanks, everyone, for a
Thank you.
insightful
Thanks.
and
Thank
very
you.
fun, lively discussion. Thanks to the Premier's League, Christy
Thanks.
Clark, Daryl Dexter, and Robert Giz. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.